Ronald Adrian Gray is one of the most infamous criminals in the history of the U.S. military. Between April 1986 and January 1987, Gray, a 22-year-old Army specialist stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, led a double life. By day, he worked as a cook in the U.S. Army. By night, he was a sadistic predator who terrorized women in the Fayetteville area. His string of crimes began with sexual assaults. He stalked and raped several women, some of whom were fellow service members. But the violence escalated. Gray abducted and murdered 18-year-old Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay, a fellow soldier, after she left her barracks to go shopping. He raped and stabbed her, leaving her body in the woods. Shortly after, he attacked and killed Kimberly Ann Rubbles, a civilian taxi driver. He lured her to a secluded area, raped her, stabbed her repeatedly, and left her body behind a dumpster. Her murder ultimately led to Gray's arrest when police connected the evidence from the crime scene to him. What investigators uncovered next shocked the military and the public. Gray had committed at least 4 murders and 8 rapes, all while actively serving in uniform. His crimes were violent, targeted, and methodically concealed. It was clear he had no intention of stopping. In 1988, he was court-martialed and convicted of multiple counts of rape, murder, and attempted murder. The military sentenced him to death. Gray also stood trial in a civilian court for overlapping crimes and received several life sentences there as well. In 2008, President George W. Bush signed a military execution order, the first such presidential approval in over 50 years. Gray was scheduled for execution by lethal injection, but his legal team launched a series of appeals that have delayed his sentence for more than a decade. Today, Ronald A. Gray remains on military death row at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He is the longest-serving inmate with a signed execution order and may one day become the first U.S. service member executed by the military since 1961. Hassan K. Akbar. On March 23, 2003, just days before U.S. forces launched the ground invasion of Iraq, a chilling act of betrayal took place within the ranks of the U.S. Army. It was an attack not by an enemy soldier, but by one of their own, Sergeant Hassan Kareem Akbar. Born Mark Fidel Cools, Akbar had legally changed his name years earlier. At 31 years old, he was serving in the 1000 Airborne Division, stationed at Camp Pennsylvania in Kuwait. His background was unusual for a soldier. He had a high IQ, a college degree, and a history of mental health struggles. Fellow soldiers described him as quiet, isolated, and paranoid. But no one expected what he was planning. In the early hours of March 23, under cover of darkness, Akbar crept into the area where his fellow soldiers were sleeping in tents. He was armed with fragmentation grenades and an M4 rifle. He pulled the pins and threw the grenades into 2 separate tents, then opened fire on anyone who tried to escape. 2 officers were killed in the ambush, Captain Christopher Seifert and Major Gregory Stone. 14 others were wounded, many of them seriously. Some were burned by the blasts, others were shot. It was chaos, and it took fellow soldiers several minutes to realize the attacker was one of their own. Akbar was tackled and detained. During questioning, he admitted to planning the attack, expressing resentment toward his fellow soldiers. In his diary, he wrote that he believed other troops were conspiring to kill him. He also made references to being rejected and ridiculed, and hinted at a growing hatred for the Army's mission in the Middle East. He was charged with 2 counts of premeditated murder and 3 counts of attempted premeditated murder. During his court-martial in 2005, military prosecutors described the act as premeditated fragging, a term used to describe soldiers who kill their own comrades, a phenomenon most associated with the Vietnam War. The defense cited Akbar's deteriorating mental state and paranoia, arguing he was delusional. But the jury was unconvinced. He was convicted and sentenced to death. It was the first time since the Gulf War that a U.S. soldier had been sentenced to death for killing fellow soldiers in a combat zone. Hassan Akbar is currently held on military death row at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth. His appeals have continued for over 18 years, but the verdict stands. What made Akbar's crime so haunting wasn't just the deaths. It was the context. He attacked his unit on the brink of war. While others were preparing to face a foreign enemy, he became the enemy within. Timothy Hennis. In 1985, one of the most brutal murders in North Carolina history rocked the quiet town of Fayetteville. A crime so horrific that even years later, the case would resurface, leading to one of the most unprecedented legal sagas in American military justice. The victims were 31-year-old Catherine Eastburn and her two young daughters, 5-year-old Erin and 3-year-old Kara. They were found stabbed to death in their home, their throats slashed, blood covering the walls and floors. Their husband and father, Air Force Captain Gary Eastburn, had been away on duty in Alabama. The community was stunned. The Eastburns had been planning to move, and in the days before the murders, they had placed an ad to rehome their family dog. That's how they met a young U.S. Army soldier stationed at nearby Fort Bragg, Timothy Hennis. Hennis answered the ad and adopted the dog, but within days, he became the prime suspect in the killings. Witnesses reported seeing a man matching his description near the Eastburn home. The timeline fit. Blood type analysis, before the era of DNA testing, seemed to link him to the crime. He was arrested, tried, and convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. In 1986, he was sentenced to death. But that wasn't the end. Hennis appealed, and in 1989, a higher court overturned the conviction, citing prejudicial evidence and prosecutorial misconduct. He was granted a new trial, and in 1990, he was acquitted. The jury found reasonable doubt. Hennis walked out a free man. He returned to the Army, resumed his military career, and eventually retired with full honors. But in 2005, nearly 2 decades after the crime, DNA testing technology had advanced. Evidence preserved from the crime scene was re-examined. This time, the results were conclusive. Semen found inside Catherine Eastburn matched only one person, Timothy Hennis. There was just one problem: double jeopardy. He had already been acquitted. Under civilian law, he couldn't be retried. But the military operates under a different system. Because Hennis was still subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the Army recalled him to active duty and charged him again, this time in a court-martial. In 2010, a military jury convicted him of the murders and sentenced him to death, making him one of the only Americans in history to be tried, acquitted, and later convicted for the same crime under different legal systems. Today, Timothy Hennis sits on military death row at Fort Leavenworth. His case remains one of the most extraordinary legal odysseys in American history, a grim reminder that even when justice seems finished, it may only be waiting to begin. Again, Nidal Hasan. On November 5, 2009, a U.S. Army psychiatrist walked into the Soldier Readiness Processing Center at Fort Hood, Texas, and opened fire on his fellow service members. When the gunfire stopped, 13 people were dead, and more than 30 others were wounded. The man behind the attack was Major Nidal Malik Hasan, a military officer, a doctor, and a terrorist. Hasan was born in Virginia, the son of Palestinian immigrants. He joined the Army and became a psychiatrist, eventually rising to the rank of major. By 2009, he was stationed at Fort Hood, preparing to deploy to Afghanistan. But behind the scenes, Hasan had become increasingly radicalized. He had been communicating with Anwar al-Awlaki, a known extremist cleric linked to al-Qaeda. In emails, Hasan asked whether it was permissible under Islam to kill U.S. soldiers preparing to deploy to Muslim countries. He was not only ideologically motivated, he believed he was on a religious mission. That mission turned deadly. Armed with a semi-automatic pistol and shouting Allahu Akbar, Hasan began firing into the crowd of soldiers awaiting deployment orders. He showed no distinction between officers and enlisted, men and women. He moved methodically, targeting those in uniform. One pregnant soldier was among the dead. Hasan was eventually stopped by civilian police officer Kimberly Munley, who was shot 3 times during the exchange. Despite his injuries, Hasan survived, paralyzed from the waist down by a bullet wound to the spine. The case was immediately classified as an act of terrorism. But controversy followed. The Department of Defense initially labeled it workplace violence, sparking outrage from victims and lawmakers. Many believed this was an act of war. not just a criminal offense. In 1913, nearly 4 years after the massacre, Hassan was court-martialed. He represented himself at trial, showed no remorse, and declared allegiance to Islamic extremism. He admitted to the killings, and said he wished he had been killed in the process. He wanted to be a martyr. The jury unanimously found him guilty of 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to death. The first military death sentence handed down since 2005. Hassan remains on military death row at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. His execution has not yet been scheduled, as military death sentences require presidential approval, a step that has not been taken since the 1950s. The Fort Hood massacre was the deadliest mass shooting on a U.S. military base in history. For many, it was a betrayal not just of country, but of the oath Hassan swore as a soldier and a physician, to protect life. Instead, he took it, in the place where soldiers are supposed to be safest. Common Perry. In the jungles of World War II's Forgotten Front, the China-Burma-India Theater, a U.S. Army private named Herman Perry committed a crime so shocking that it led to one of the most extraordinary manhunts in military history. Herman Perry was a black soldier assigned to one of the most grueling and dangerous assignments of the war, constructing the Ledo Road, a massive supply road connecting India to China. Conditions were brutal. The terrain was treacherous. Heat, disease, and exhaustion claimed countless lives. And for the segregated black soldiers doing the hardest labor, morale was low and mistreatment was common. In March 1944, Perry had had enough. After a confrontation with a white officer, Lieutenant Harold Clotter, Perry drew a .45 caliber pistol and shot him point blank. The officer died almost instantly. Perry fled into the jungle. What followed was a manhunt unlike anything the U.S. Army had conducted before. For weeks, Perry eluded capture by vanishing into the wilderness. But this wasn't just survival. Perry managed to integrate himself into a remote Naga hill tribe, deep in the jungle. He lived among them. He adapted to their customs. He even married a local woman. For a time, it seemed as though he had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the terrain. But eventually, the army caught up with him. He was arrested, returned to military custody, and charged with murder. The court-martial was swift, despite evidence of racial bias and brutal conditions that may have contributed to his mental collapse. He was found guilty. In September 1945, just weeks after the end of the war, Herman Perry was executed by hanging, the only American soldier executed in the China-Burma-India Theater during World War II. His case is rarely discussed in military history, buried under decades of silence and classified files. But in recent years, it has gained attention from historians, journalists, and civil rights scholars. Herman Perry wasn't a war criminal in the traditional sense. He didn't kill an enemy. He didn't desert to join another army. He killed an officer, and then, for a brief, surreal moment, vanished into another world. His story is one of race, rebellion, and rage, a unique and tragic chapter in the legacy of military justice. William Calley. Second Lieutenant William Calley is perhaps the most infamous American military officer ever convicted of war crimes. His name is forever etched into history alongside one of the darkest and most shameful events of the Vietnam War, the My Lai massacre. On the morning of March 16, 1968, Calley led a platoon of soldiers from Charlie Company into the small hamlet of My Lai, located in Quam Ngai province in South Vietnam. Their mission, according to Army intelligence, was to root out Viet Cong fighters supposedly operating in the area. But there were no Viet Cong in My Lai. No armed resistance. No ambush waiting in the tree line. What happened instead was a systematic slaughter of more than 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians. Men, women, children, and the elderly. Many were shot execution style. Women were raped before being killed. Infants were ripped from their mothers' arms and thrown into ditches. Entire families were wiped out in a matter of hours. Calley personally ordered many of the killings. According to eyewitnesses, he told his men to waste them and kill anything that moves. Several soldiers testified that Calley picked up a child, threw the child into a ditch, and shot him. Others described him marching groups of villagers to irrigation ditches, where they were gunned down in cold blood. Not every soldier participated. A few refused to carry out the orders. One helicopter crew, led by Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, Jr., intervened by landing between the soldiers and a group of villagers, threatening to open fire on American troops if they didn't stop the killing. That crew's actions saved lives, but couldn't stop the massacre already underway. Initially, the U.S. Army tried to cover up what happened. The official report claimed a great victory with numerous enemy combatants killed. But photos, taken by Army photographer Ronald Haberly, and whistleblower reports from soldiers like Ron Ridenhour forced the truth into the open. The backlash was swift and massive. Public opinion, already divided on the war, turned even more sharply. The My Lai massacre became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in Vietnam. In 1971, William Calley was court-martialed and convicted of the premeditated murder of 22 villagers. He was sentenced to life in prison. But just 3 days after the sentence was handed down, President Richard Nixon intervened. Calley was placed under house arrest, and in total, he served just 3.5 years of confinement before being released in 1974. To this day, his light punishment is widely viewed as a failure of justice. No one else was ever convicted in connection to the massacre. Hundreds died, and only one man was held accountable. Briefly, in 2009, Calley issued a rare public apology, saying, "There is not a day that goes by that I do not feel remorse for what happened that day in My Lai." But for survivors and families of the victims, remorse cannot replace accountability. William Calley's story is not just one of guilt. It is a lesson in how war can be humanized, how the chain of command can be twisted into chaos, and how justice, when filtered through politics and public outrage, can become something else entirely. Andrew Witt. In the summer of 2004, a quiet U.S. Air Force base in Georgia became the scene of a chilling double homicide, committed not by an outsider, but by a fellow airman. The killer, 23-year-old senior airman Andrew Paul Witt. Witt was stationed at Robins Air Force Base, working in aircraft maintenance. He was described by peers as socially awkward but largely unremarkable, until the night of July 5, 2004, when everything changed. Earlier that week, Witt had attended a party with fellow airmen. During the gathering, he made unwanted advances toward another airman's wife, which led to a confrontation. The situation was tense, but it seemed to pass. It didn't. 2 days later, armed with a knife, Witt broke into the home of his co-worker, Senior Airman Andy Schleipzig. In a shocking act of rage, Witt stabbed Schleipzig to death. Then he turned on Andy's wife, Jamie, and stabbed her multiple times, killing her as well. There was a third victim, Jamie's friend, who had been visiting. She fought Witt off and survived despite being stabbed multiple times. Witt fled the scene, but was quickly arrested by base security. When questioned, he confessed in detail. He showed no signs of a psychotic break. He simply said he was angry and wanted revenge for the embarrassment he felt at the party. The Air Force charged him with 2 counts of premeditated murder and 1 count of attempted murder. At his court-martial, prosecutors argued that Witt's actions were not only deliberate but cold-blooded. He brought the knife. He broke into the home while they slept. And he slaughtered 2 people who once considered him a friend. In 2005, Witt was convicted and sentenced to death, making him the first active-duty airman in decades to receive the death penalty. His case drew national attention because of how ordinary everything seemed leading up to the murders. There were no signs of serious mental illness, no history of violence, no political or ideological motive. It was a case of personal vengeance, carried out in the most brutal way possible. But Witt's death sentence didn't last. In 1916, a military appeals court overturned the sentence, ruling that his defense counsel had been ineffective during the penalty phase. A new sentencing hearing was ordered. In 1920, Witt was resentenced, this time to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving that sentence in a military prison, far from the base where he once worked side by side with the people he would later kill. Andrew Witt's story is a reminder that even within the structure and discipline of the U.S. military, violence can erupt from the most personal of grievances and destroy lives in an instant. Dwight Loving. On a cold night in December 1988, two innocent men, both civilian taxi drivers, were gunned down in Texas by a man they had trusted to pay his fare. That man was Private Dwight Jeffrey Loving, a 20-year-old soldier stationed at Fort Hood. The murders were senseless, brutal, and committed for no reason other than greed and thrill. Loving's spree began on December 11th, when he hailed a cab from a convenience store in Killeen, Texas. The driver, 20-year-old Christopher Fay, took him on a short drive. At their destination, Loving pulled a .45 caliber pistol and ordered Fay out of the car. He marched him into a secluded field and shot him in the back of the head. Then he shot him again, to make sure he was dead. Hours later, Loving called for another cab. This time, it was 26-year-old Bobby Sharbino who responded. The same pattern played out. A short ride, followed by a robbery, then a cold-blooded execution. Sharbino was shot in the head and left in a ditch. He died alone in the dark. But Dwight Loving wasn't done. He returned to his girlfriend's apartment and bragged about the murders. He waved the pistol around. He told her he'd earned some money tonight. When the police eventually arrested him, they found the murder weapon and evidence linking him to both scenes. Loving quickly confessed, not out of remorse, but out of arrogance. He told investigators he'd considered killing more cab drivers for fun. At his court-martial in 1989, the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of premeditated murder, robbery, and illegal use of a firearm. The military jury deliberated for just 3 hours before sentencing him to death. Loving was sent to military death row at Fort Leavenworth, where he remained for nearly 30 years. Throughout that time, he filed numerous appeals, each one denied. But in 2017, just days before President Barack Obama left office, a final appeal reached the Oval Office. Obama commuted Loving's sentence from death to life imprisonment without parole, sparking national debate. For some, it was a humane act, consistent with Obama's stance on the death penalty. For others, it was a betrayal of justice. Today, Dwight Loving is still behind bars, but he is no longer on death row. His case is one of the most clear-cut examples of military justice working swiftly and decisively. Two innocent men died for no reason. Their families never got the closure of seeing their loved one's killer executed. But they did see him face trial, conviction, and lifetime confinement. Loving didn't kill out of rage, or war, or ideology. He killed because he wanted to, and that, more than anything, is what makes his crimes so disturbing. John E. Day. During the Korean War, the U.S. military faced not only the horrors of combat, but the darker reality of crime within its own ranks. Among the most severe cases was that of Army Private John E. Day, a soldier whose brutal actions led to one of the rare executions carried out by the U.S. military in the 20th century. John E. Day was deployed to Korea in the early 1950s, a time of violent conflict and severe tension along the peninsula. But Day's crime had nothing to do with the enemy. It happened in South Korea, and it shocked even seasoned military commanders. According to court-martial records, Day raped a South Korean woman. When her husband attempted to intervene, Day shot and killed him. Their infant child died shortly after, either as a direct result of the violence or due to neglect in the aftermath of the attack. It was a crime of extraordinary cruelty. And it wasn't committed on the battlefield. It was committed against civilians who were supposed to be protected. He was arrested by military authorities, court-martialed, and convicted of murder and rape. The trial was swift, and the outcome was clear. Day was sentenced to death. Unlike most death sentences handed down by military courts, his was actually carried out. In 1959, John E. Day was executed by hanging at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. His name faded from public memory, overshadowed by larger events in the Cold War and Civil Rights era. But his execution marked the beginning of a long pause. After Day, no American service member would be executed by the military for over 60 years. His case remains a rare example of a military capital sentence enforced to its full extent. It is largely forgotten, not taught in history classes, not mentioned in textbooks. But it stands as a grim reminder that military justice, at times, can be absolute. In an era before DNA, before 24-hour news, before transparency, John E. Day became one of the few soldiers to face the gallows under the American flag. And for decades, he remained a footnote in the history of military law, a warning to those who wear the uniform but break its code. John Arthur Bennett. John Arthur Bennett's name is rarely spoken today, but his execution marks a historical endpoint. He was the last person to be executed by the United States military, and the circumstances surrounding his case still provoke intense debate about race, justice, and the limits of mercy. Born in 1936 in Virginia, Bennett was a black man from a working-class family with limited education. He enlisted in the U.S. Army at a young age and was stationed in Austria in the early 1950s as part of post-World War II occupation forces. On April 3, 1954, after a night of heavy drinking and unauthorized absence from his barracks, Bennett entered the home of an Austrian family in the town of Horn. What happened next would seal his fate. According to court records, Bennett raped and attempted to strangle the family's 11-year-old daughter. The girl survived and was able to identify him. The crime was reported immediately, and Bennett was arrested the same night. He was tried by a general court-martial and convicted of rape and attempted murder, both capital offenses under the Uniform Code of Military Justice at the time. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The brutality of the crime was undeniable. But what made Bennett's case so controversial was what happened afterward. Numerous appeals for clemency were filed, not only by military officials, but by leaders in the Austrian government, humanitarian organizations, and even the victim's own family. After the family converted to Catholicism, they sent a personal plea for mercy, stating they had forgiven him and hoped his life would be spared. But despite this, President Dwight D. Eisenhower denied clemency. Bennett's fate was sealed. On April 13, 1961, John Bennett was executed by hanging at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He was 26 years old. His death was the first military execution since World War II, and it remains the most recent. Though others have since been sentenced to death by military courts, none have been executed. Bennett's execution has drawn sharp criticism over the years. At the time of his death, 53 U.S. military personnel had been sentenced to death for rape between 1951 and 1960. 52 of them were black. That staggering statistic raised uncomfortable questions about racial bias in military justice. For some, John Bennett's punishment was a symbol of discipline, the ultimate price for a heinous act. For others, it was the product of a deeply flawed system that offered little mercy to a poor, black soldier accused on foreign soil. More than 6 decades later, John Bennett remains a historical milestone, not because he was the worst offender in military history, but because no one has come after him. His execution marked the end of a practice that technically still exists, but has never been used since. He was the last, and possibly, he always will be.